The Last Dog, based on the short story by Katherine Paterson. Background: in science fiction, writers create new worlds by mixing scientific information with ideas from their own imaginations. Science fiction stories are often set in the distant future, perhaps in an outer space or on an Earth that is different from ours. Science fiction plots are often about challenges created by unusual settings. Brock walked up to the computer at the customs gate. People wanting to leave or come back had to stop there to check in or out. "This is highly unusual, Brock," the disembodied voice said. "What is your reason for travel outside the dome?" "Scientific research," he replied. He'd never heard of anyone leaving the dome to do research. "The research team gave me permission to go." "Are you wearing the protective suit with helmet and gloves?" "Yes, affirmative." "You have enough liquid food and tablets for only 1 day of travel?" "Affirmative." Brock walked to the gate. Why weren't they asking him more questions? Ever since he had said he wanted to go outside the dome, people had treated him strangely. Did they think he was a deviant? Someone who acted strangely? Deviants sometimes disappeared. There were stories that deviants had gone outside, but no one really knew. They said that no deviant ever returned to the dome. The gate opened and Brock stepped outside. He blinked. The sun was too bright for his eyes. He turned and looked at the dome one last time. Then he started to walk toward the mountain he saw in the distance. He recognized them from holograms. Brock didn't know of anyone who had left the dome, but there were protective suits and equipment, like his, to protect anyone who did. He also carried a scanner, a computer that would warn him of dangers and describe his emotions to him. He asked the person who gave him the suit and scanner about why they had the equipment like this, but she was evasive. She said that people used to go outside the dome, but the world was too frightening. Hardly anyone ever used the equipment anymore. Was Brock, then, the only person who was still curious? Or had all of the other people who had gone outside died, scaring people out of further attempts? If Brock never returned, he'd have no one to blame but himself. While his podfellows, others about his age living inside the dome, had played games on computers, he had spent time reading ancient fictions or novels. Their characters seemed real to Brock. They had strange names like Huck Finn and M.C. Higgins the Great. He had read the stories again and again. The novels made him wonder about the world outside the dome. In other words, far in the future, people live inside a protective dome. They believe that the outside world is too dangerous for people to live in. Brock gets permission to go on a research trip outside the dome. Reading novels makes Brock interested in the world outside the dome. No one has returned from such a trip. Now Brock was in that world, and he could see its mountains. Close to the dome, the land was clear, but after he walked for an hour or so, he passed ruins. The wrecked buildings may have been places where people lived long ago. He had an unfamiliar feeling. The scanner told him that the feeling was loneliness. He liked having names for new feelings. He was alone for the first time in his life. Perhaps he should have taken one of the other podfellows along. But they all laughed when he spoke of going outside. Ever since he started reading the ancient fictions, his podfellows thought he was odd, not like them. Perhaps he should have taken a robopet, a robot in the form of a pet, along for company. But he didn't really like the robopet his pod shared. He had not understood how far he needed to walk to reach the mountains. It was now well past noon, and he had nearly 2 miles to go. Should he send a signal that he would be late, or should he head home now? He had only a day's supply of water and food pellets. Still, he was closer to the mountains than to the dome. He felt what the scanner told him was excitement, and kept going. Actual trees grew on the first hill. The leader of Brock's pod, the podmaster, had said that trees no longer existed, that they had become extinct. Brock pulled off a leaf. It was green and had veins. In some ways, it looked like his hand. He put the leaf in his pack so that he could study it later. He didn't want anyone saying that he had started paying more attention to his feelings. He didn't want anyone saying that he had stopped using scientific information. Only deviants did that. Then he heard the sound of water running. He checked the scanner. There was no danger signal. He hurried toward the sound. It was a brook. He was sure of it. In the dome, he was taught that these small streams had become poisonous and then dried up when the world grew hot. But here was a brook. He first wanted to take off his glove and dip a finger in the brook, but he didn't. He had been trained to avoid danger. He sat down on the ground. Yes, this must be grass. There were even some small flowers. Would the air poison him if he took off his helmet and breathed it? He decided not to try. He pushed some buttons. A tube appeared in his mouth. It dropped a food pellet on his tongue. Then he sucked in some liquid and swallowed his meal. What did novels call eating outside? A picnic. He was having a picnic in the woods by a brook. The scanner told him that he felt pleasure. It was then that he heard the new sound. The scanner did not indicate danger, so he went towards it. Something was lying under a tree's shadow. It was 3 foot long. It was 3 foot long and furry, but it wasn't moving. Then he saw the puppy. With its nose, it was poking the stiff body of what must have been its mother. It was making a little crying sounds he had heard. In other words, as he walks toward the mountains, Brock finds out that he was not taught the truth about the world outside the dome. He had been told that trees and running water no longer existed. He finds both and a puppy too. Brock could guess the puppy was sad, but he didn't know what missing a mother would feel like. There were no mothers in the dome. Instead, children were born in a laboratory and raised together. Computers and a podmaster, not parents, watched over them. Brock had never seen a dog, but he had learned about them. There had been many dogs once. They filled the stories he had read. They even had names: Lassie, Toto, Sounder. Now there were no dogs at all. The people who stayed outside the domes had killed all the animals for food. After that, the people had died out. Obviously, dogs still existed, though. Brock moved towards the puppy. Alert, alert, scanning unknown object. Brock pushed the off button. Are you sure you want to turn off scanner? Yes, affirmative. The puppy looked at him as if deciding whether to run or stay. It's all right, dog, Brock said. I won't hurt you. He stayed still. He didn't want to frighten it. He held out his gloved hand. The dog backed away. But when Brock kept his hand out, the puppy slowly crept toward him and sniffed, making soft crying noises. It was looking for food. Brock looked first at the dead mother, who could no longer feed her puppy, and then around the landscape. What would a puppy eat? He took out one of his food pellets, moving slowly so he would not scare the dog. He held it out. The puppy gulped down the pellet. Then it ran over to the brook. Brock watched in horror as it drank from the poisoned stream. "Don't!" Brock yelled. The puppy turned for a second, but then it kept drinking, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. The puppy was breathing the poisoned air too, wasn't it? Why hadn't Brock thought of it before? The puppy lived outside the dome without any protective gear. What could it mean? The puppy made more crying noises and looked up at Brock with large, trusting eyes. For the first time in his life, Brock felt something for another living thing. An emotion. The thought of the puppy suffering here next to its dead parent until the puppy died of hunger was terrible. "Your name is Borg, all right?" "Brog. Your name is Brog, all right?" Brock said to the puppy. "Don't worry, Brog. I won't let you starve. I'll get food for you." That's why Brock returned to the dome's entrance after dark, carrying a lively and wriggling Canis familiaris. Those words, Brock knew, were the scientific name for dog. In other words, Brock finds and makes friends with a puppy whose mother has died. He worries that the puppy will starve if he leaves it alone. He names the dog Brog and takes it with him when he returns to the dome. The voice of the customs monitor spoke to him. "Welcome back, Brock. You're late." "Affirmative." "Computer detects something warm-blooded. This is not on the list." "I found a dog," Brock mumbled. "Canis familiaris is extinct. Dogs no longer exist." "Well, maybe it's just a robo-pet that got out." "Correction. Robo-pets are bloodless. Proceed to quarantine inspection." The inspectors, who rarely had anything to check, were nervous at first. Then they watched the puppy happily licking Brock's face and became interested. An actual dog! None of them had ever seen one. Brock's dog was lively, unlike a robo-pet. They knew they should have killed the dog or sent it back outside the dome, but they couldn't do it. "It will have to go to research," the chief inspector finally said. The scientists in research were amazed to see a live Canis familiaris, but they stayed back. Only one scientist, dressed in protective clothing, came into the laboratory. He poked and prodded the poor dog until it began to whimper. He learned that Brog was female. "Brog needs to rest," said Brock, stopping the scientist in the middle of his inspection. "She's had a hard day, and she needs actual food. She's not used to pellets." One of the scientists in the observation booth answered through a speaker. "Send someone out for a McLike burger without sauce. She may think it's meat." Brock realized that the scientists wanted him to give them advice about Brog. He was, after all, the person who had discovered the last dog. They treated him as someone who was important and smart, and Brock took advantage and made the most of it. He insisted on staying with Brog. "She's not like us," he explained. "In the old stories, puppies cried all night if they were separated from their families. She needs to have contact with another warm-blooded animal, or she might die of loneliness. The scientists agreed. In other words, scientists in the dome stay away from the dog because she is from outside the dome. Brock persuades them to let him stay with Brog in the research center. He tells them that puppies need to be with other living things. For nearly a week, Brock lived with Brog in the research center. The dog quickly learned to obey Brock's commands, but it wasn't the automatic response of a robopet. Brog enjoyed obedience. She wanted to please Brock. Those few times when she did not obey Brock, Brog looked up with sorrowful eyes, begging to be forgiven. He put his arms around her and held her. He noticed that one of the scientists was watching. Well, let him watch. Nothing was as wonderful as feeling this warmth towards another creature. Then, Brock woke in the middle of the night. He heard an argument. One of the researchers had forgotten to turn off the speaker. Cloning is the only thing to do. If she's the last, we owe it to posterity to keep producing dogs. And we're going to raise a pack of dogs in the dome? We don't have enough food for them. We have to be realistic. Besides, no one has had a chance to do experiments on such an animal in the dome. What about the boy? He won't agree. He's with the dog all the time. He's developed strong feelings for it. Can you think of what a disaster it would be if a flood of emotions happened in a controlled environment such as ours? Creatures like dogs inspire powerful emotions, another said. Shh! Not now. The speaker is... The system clicked off, but Brock had already heard. He knew he had lost his scientific objectivity, his ability to focus on facts, not feelings. He was no longer sure he wanted it. He enjoyed being flooded by emotions, but he was more worried for Brog than for himself. Cloning would be bad enough. 10 dogs who looked just like Brog, so no one would know how unique Brog was? But experiments! They'd cut her open and examine her insides. They'd try to change her personality, who Brog was. In other words, Brock hears the scientists talking about what to do with Brog. He worries that they will clone her or perform experiments on her. He cares about Brog and does not want her to suffer or to have her personality changed. The next day, Brog pretended to be sick. Brog stayed with him. The scientists didn't care. They were too busy thinking about what they might do with Brog. Brock crept to the nearest computer in the lab. The scientists had been studying dog diseases. Brock looked down the list. What he needed was a disease that might affect people as well as dogs. Here it was! Rabies! A disease occurring in animals and humans, especially in dogs and wolves, passed along by bite or scratch. The early stages of the disease are the most dangerous. For an otherwise healthy and friendly animal will suddenly bite. Rabies was it. He would have to make Brog bite him. In the dome, there was no medicine to cure rabies. They'd be so afraid of spreading the disease that they'd make both Brog and him leave. No matter what was outside, Brock couldn't stand to go back to the life he had lived in the dome before he met Brog. He waited until the right moment. All the scientists had gathered in the lab. They were explaining to Brock and Brog what must be done. "It has to be done for the sake of science," they began, "and for the sake of the dome community, which is always short on food and water. It won't be as if she'll be gone, you know. We've made computer copies of her. You can play with her on your computer whenever you would like." That was all Brock needed to hear. He turned and bit Brog on the tail so hard it bled. Brog, surprised and angry, spun around and bit Brock on the nose. There was a shocked silence. I don't know what got into me," Brock said. "I've been feeling strange." All of the scientists ran out of the room as fast as they could. When Brock offered to take Brog out of the dome to let her loose in the mountains, no one argued. No one came close as he packed some water and food pellets. The customs gate monitor asked him no questions. In other words, Brock wants to save Brog from the scientists. He plans to escape from the dome by pretending that he and Brog have rabies. He bites Brog so the dog will bite him back. Frightened, the scientists let Brock and the dog leave the dome. Out of sight of the dome, Brog was full of joy. She ran in circles around Brock's boots. If the air was poisonous, as people in the dome said, why wasn't it choking Brog? Brock unscrewed his helmet a little. Nothing happened. In fact, he seemed to be breathing normally. He took off the helmet. He was still breathing freely. He waited to start choking, as he had been warned. It didn't happen. Could people in the dome be wrong? Could the outside world have healed itself? Could fear have kept them prisoners many years longer than a poisoned environment would have? He unfastened the protective suit and slowly stepped out of it into the sunlight. "Who knows," Brock said to Brog. "Maybe out here you aren't the last dog. Your mother had to come from somewhere." Brog barked happily. "And maybe, just maybe, where there are dogs, there are people too." They stopped at the brook where they'd met. Both of them took a long drink. Brock no longer carried a scanner, but he knew that he felt excitement. The water was delicious. In other words, outside, Brock discovers that the air is safe to breathe and the water is safe to drink. He wonders whether there are people living outside the dome.